How to Deal with Doubts by Ravi Zacharias. Let me check my levels before I start here. This is filmed in front of a live studio audience, so I will be talking to people during this if you're watching the replay. Hopefully it won't be my kids who are causing trouble, making noise. Microphone levels 100%. That's what I like to see. 100%. Actually, I tell my kids in school when they do when they take tests, I prefer they get 99% rather than 100 on their test. That way, there's a little bit of wiggle room for improvement, and it keeps them humble. Because humility is something I pride myself in. You know, just when I thought I could just go along with my day and get some real work done, you know, provide bread and butter, meat and potatoes for the family on the dinner table, I have to look at Frank Turek's YouTube channel and just see I should almost have, forgive me for what I'm about to say, but I almost should have called this Apologists Say the Darndest Things. But welcome everyone who made it on the day after July 4th, if you're an American. Ravi Zacharias, I was a Christian for 30 years. And for all you Christians, Calvinists out there, I wasn't a true Christian. Of course not. That's silliness, right? But I was a professing Christian for 30 years. And you know, one of my favorite apologists was Ravi Zacharias because he seemed so smart and intelligent and was a great storyteller. And I want to play a clip of, let's see, is this the right clip? Of someone asking him a question on how to deal with doubts. Here we go.
So I'm reading questions that have come in on my phone, so just so you know, I'm not checking college football scores or anything like that. But spoiler alert, Tennessee is really bad this year.
We already knew that.
Yes. This one came in for Ravi. It's the person who ran the question says, sometimes I have doubts in my faith and I feel guilty about it. What is this about? And do you ever have doubts?
Remember that list, 10 questions that apologists don't like? Well, this is one of them. So kudos to them asking this question. What are some of your doubts? How do you handle doubts and so forth?
I think it's an important thing to, first of all, differentiate in your own mind whether you're talking about a doubt or a question. As you're walking through with the Lord and in your commitment to Christ, you will always have questions. Moses struggled with them, Jeremiah struggled with them, Elijah struggled with them. You see the new...
Oh, is it just me or does that whistle every time he talks bother? But I'm not judging, I just got to fight through that.
New Testament characters struggling with them. A question, when you're struggling against a question, you have that underlying belief that God must have an answer to this, and I want the answer. But a doubt is making you question whether God actually even has the answer or whether God is even out there.
Okay, so what Ravi is, I'm just going to summarize. Ravi's saying that having questions is fine, but doubt is a little more serious because doubt is talking about, does God even exist? Is he even real? Is he even out there?
So let me answer your question in two ways. Because of the nature of my own conversion and how I wasn't seeking after him, but he sought after me, and what he did in my life and my family's life, I can honestly say to you, I have never had any doubts, because God's mercy and grace was so pronounced that I have no other explanation. I think Warren was talking about...
Did you guys hear what he just said? Now, if I was a Christian listening to this, I'm telling you the truth. I can put myself back into that worldview. I can put myself back to the days when I was a Christian. And hearing that would make my skin crawl a little bit. Let me rewind what he said.
This was so pronounced that I have no other explanation. I think Warren was talking about an explanatory power within a room. There's no way for me to explain what happened in my life in a closed system.
What's wrong with that answer? Anything? Christians, please let's think about this. Ravi's saying he has no doubts. He's never doubted because he has, what was his exact words? No explanation for what happened in his life. What's wrong with that answer, if anything? I know there's a lot of non-Christians listening to this right now, and it's just like obvious. But if you're a Christian listening to this, is it obvious to you why this is a bad answer? I hope it is. Or can you even at least guess why this is a horrible answer? But at the same time, when I say it's a bad answer, horrible answer, I believe Ravi. I think it's an honest answer. And I think it's an answer that probably most of the other three gentlemen on this panel have. But let me, in case you're a believer and you're still saying, Doug, what are you talking about? What's this stupid, dirty atheist talking about, that this is a bad answer? Let me show you why I think it's a bad answer. I'm going to bring up, remember, Ravi Zacharias was born and raised in India. His siblings were all great at school, became professionals. He didn't, at least not so much. And he tried to commit suicide because of that. But what I want to bring up is a video called Spiritual Witness that many of you have already seen, but probably few Christians have. And this is why that answer... Now remember, he said he doesn't doubt because of what he experienced in his life, and he has no explanation for it. Now, if Matt Dillahunty would say, argument from ignorance and move on, right? But let me try to really get the empathy in here, why one should not be so confident for that particular reason. And I'm just going to bring up at random, this is a video called Spiritual Witness. I think this is the right one. And I'm just going to, at random, pick a person here. It's basically personal testimonies from different religions in the world. I'm going to stop there.
That time, but for myself it was excruciating to watch basically the annihilation of the person that I love the most.
This is Divine Truth cult.
Whenever I think about him now, I just cry.
Pressed on your soul. And then the cool thing
Mormon.
is it's not something that happens once, it's something that happens over and over again.
Asking God. When I went home that night, I opened up the Book of Mormon and I started reading it, and I just had this warm feeling come over me.
Warm feelings.
This is true, you know? And I knew right there it's the correct religion.
And at that point, I had this feeling of just peace. Just that's how I describe it, like peace.
Who do I have to follow to come to you direct? Christianity or the Muslims? I was 100% sure that God has answered my question.
Been in the class, there's never
Heaven's
been
Gate.
a doubt.
Like when I first met them, I knew that
No doubt.
what they had to say was true. It wasn't something they said, it was something that I knew inside me. I felt it was like a...
Now, even though these people didn't use those exact words of no other explanation, I think it's... If you're a Christian listening to this, and you're hearing one of the top apologists in the world, I don't know how top he is nowadays, but at least in Canada, he's really popular, my home nation, and fairly popular in the United States, saying, I don't doubt, my confidence is extremely high in God, Jesus, whatever, because I can't think of any other reason for what happened to me in my life. Imagine 3,000 years ago, seeing lightning for the first time. Let's say you're like a 6 or 7 year old and, well, I can't explain that. Must be God. Or any other, see a volcano erupt. Why is there this red liquid coming out of the top of a mountain? Must be God. Why was it that I was handed a Bible when I was in line in the hospital bed from my mother, who was witness from some Dutch people back in India, and those words from the Bible spoke to me? Must be God. You see the problem here? Now, I will even grant you it might be true. But you should still doubt it. You should still lower your confidence that this is actually a good reason to believe that this is true, because you have no other explanation. If you're a Christian listening to this, does this make any sense? Is this computing? Should one be confident in themselves, have confidence that what they believe is true because you can't think of another explanation for why it's not? Do you see how absolutely ridiculous? And this is the top apologist, one of the top apologists in the world, I think, Christian evangelical. Oh, yeah, let me caveat all this. If you're like a Roman Catholic or a nuanced Christian, a lot of this doesn't apply. But actually, it probably does. If you're a nuanced Roman Catholic, then you probably agree with some of these reasons, the feelings you get from the Holy Spirit and the testimony of the Holy Spirit in your life. So anyhow, I just wanted to play that, and I wanted to play, I hope that makes sense. Like, at some point...
Yes, sir, what's your name?
I think even Christians have to realize that... that these are ridiculous answers. Okay, this is the problem of God commanding to kill the innocents in the Old Testament. This is a big reason why a lot of Christians do doubt, I think. Now, again, there's some Christians out there who think that the Old Testament is just, they've run away from the Old Testament. I know of some Christians who this is the case. They just look at the Old Testament and say, no, this is not my God. And God, the Yahweh of the Old Testament is not the God I worship and serve. I serve Jesus. And but there are what's called Trinitarian Christians out there who worship Jesus as God, and they honestly, truly, sincerely struggle with some of the things in the Old Testament for good reason. And if you're in the chat right now, bring up your favorite struggle, if you're a Christian. If you're not, some of the most heinous things in the Old Testament. And I want to show you something here in a second. But let's play the question.
Y'all just went to seminary there for about 10 minutes. That was awesome. That was great stuff there. Another really hard question that is common, that I'm sure you have all faced numerous times. Maybe, Stuart, I'll ask you, and you guys can all weigh in. When it's from the Old Testament. When God demanded the total annihilation of a certain group of people, the Canaanites, and involved killing the innocent women, children of the unborn, how do we defend that? It says here, how do we defend that from...
That's a great question. So the question is, how do you defend the God of the Old Testament?
Practice.
So much to do with the questions is the way that they're framed. Because we sometimes get that positioned, and the person immediately accepts all the terms and the way that has been positioned.
So he starts off with saying, well, it's part of the problem is how the question's framed. Let me frame it this way for Christian apologists. I am quite convinced that all four of the apologists on this panel are evangelical Protestant Christians. I think that's fair to assume. And I think all four of them are Trinitarians, meaning they believe Jesus is God and God is Jesus. So let me frame the question this way. Mr. Apologist, how do you defend Jesus commanding the killing of babies in the Old Testament? How do you defend Jesus killing babies in the Old Testament?
God commanding the killing of the innocent. There are many parts to that. I would say, first of all, who is innocent? The biblical story is the story from Genesis that...
This is a common answer. William Lane Craig has used it. Well, really, babies are not innocent.
We have fallen into sin and all are guilty before a holy God. But when we come to the conquest of Canaan, you have a choice that God has made to work in the real world with real human beings in space-time. He chooses a man, Abraham, and he calls him to set out and take a people, or to form a people and become a land. So,
form a people and become a land. Let me, this is what I'm hearing when I hear this. Jesus, Yahweh, are in the real estate business. Seriously, if you're a Christian who just loves Jesus, are you aware that Jesus and Yahweh love real estate? That they like actually conquering other people to get land, real estate? Does that sit well with the God you worship and serve? That's about real estate? Maybe it's more likely that people like real estate and they use a God to justify their actions. I'm just hypothesizing here.
So incarnation in a fallen world is going to bring consequences. There are people in the fallen world who do not want to allow that plan to happen physically, in other words, so they oppose. But the command specifically to conquer the land, people, sometimes we hear a sort of an equation, equivalency, that there was an unlimited command to exercise murder, killing, or something of this nature, which is not true. There was a limited conquest of that specific, so it's geographic.
Okay, so one of his ways of defending is say, well, it didn't happen all the time, it's limited.
Limited, and it was time limited, and there was a purpose.
Oh, this is he's saying it's time limited? There was a purpose for that time? That is he saying that the God he worships and serves wouldn't do that anymore?
And there is judgment. So the problem is, when I'm talking to a person, of a naturalist who respects the fact that there is no God, and if there is a God, he must be a Santa Claus in the sky, and there must be some kind of just general love principle where God just welcomes everybody because love wins in some kind of blind way.
Yeah, God is not a postmodernist thinker. He's all for closed borders, right?
Then it's not taking into account that the biblical story introduces us to a God who is the creator and who is holy and who has purpose and a will. When the Genesis story, the story of the land comes up, we find there's the sin of the Amalekites, is said, had accumulated the practices. So you look into the social actions of the Amalekites, and the tribes in those lands, they were given opportunity 400 years to repent, and they didn't. When the people of Israel...
Yeah, so if you're a person, let's say you're an 18-year-old person at that time, you were given 400 years to repent. All your fathers, great-grandfathers, great-great-great-greatfathers, they didn't repent. So, tough luck for you.
Come in, that land had been given by promise. They chose war and destruction, and the people were authorized by God to then take the land. But as soon as the conquest of the land was over, what happened? It stopped. They didn't go then further killing or extending.
Okay, so one way to defend Jesus killing women and children in the Old Testament is to say, number one, well, they weren't innocent. And number two, it stopped. Like, it didn't go on forever. If it would have gone on forever, then I can kind of see your point. But it was limited.
They never did that. In fact, we know that they didn't kill everybody in the land. There's a metaphorical use of language, because what was the problem that came back to haunt the Israelites?
Oh, is he admitting now, well, even if the words on the text say that they killed every woman, man, and child, it's kind of metaphorical, because what came back to haunt them? Obviously, some people still live to continue the evilness down the road.
So, is the question, though, the question that does God have the right to judge? I think at the heart there's a problem with the idea that there would be a God who judges, and that this God will use violence. And by the way,
okay, so he's saying, well, of course God can use violence because he has the right to.
When I talk about violence, the most violent book in the Bible is actually the book of Revelation, isn't it?
Whoa, the most violent book in the Bible is Revelation. Okay, remember what he said earlier? That it's just for a limited time, kind of alluding to the fact that it stopped. But now he's saying actually the worst of it is yet to come.
So this violence isn't over yet. But is there a God, one who is good in his character, in his will, and his way, who invites us to repent?
How do you know God is good, Mr. Apologist? I forget this guy's name. You just, by definition, assume he is. You have no standard to judge your God. In fact, it would be a sin for you to say that God is good or not good. I mean, not good. You would just say, by definition, he is the standard of all what's good and just and right. And so you have no way to judge your God as good.
Who has provided the way of obedience, a way of surrender, a way of forgiveness, a way of being healed, a way of escaping judgment. And he has taken that because evil himself, he has taken into himself. So I think probably work with the person to frame how they're asking the question, see if we can get into some of the assumptions.
My advice, if you're talking to a person like these four, is to frame the question even more so in a way that would make them feel uncomfortable. Don't use the word God. Don't use the word Yahweh. Use the word Jesus. And I think all four of them would not have a problem with that. They can't say anything against that because I think all four of them are Trinitarians. They worship Jesus as God is God. Whatever Jesus says, the very words of Jesus are the very words of God. The very words of God are the very words of Jesus. So I think it even just makes them even more, why do you have to say it that way? But they can't say anything against it. So let me bring up the one I brought up with James White a long time ago. Numbers, what was it? 31. Oh, this is easy read version. That's a satanic version. Let's go to something that's more legitimate, like how about the RSV? Oh, you can't read that. Let me capture this. So Numbers 31. Now again, there's a lot of Christians who just don't believe that God really is speaking in the Old Testament when he talks about stuff that makes them uncomfortable. Isn't that interesting that when it's comfortable, then it's God talking, and when it's uncomfortable, it's not? Okay, so let's look at the Lord said to Moses, and let's just change that to Jesus said to Moses. I can't help it, but I'm just picturing that a 30 to 40-year-old mother, Protestant Christian in the United States who loves Jesus and has 4 kids. I wish that person was listening to me right now, but that's like a 1% chance that's going to happen. But if there is a evangelical Trinitarian mother of 4 kids listening, this is for you. It's almost like I'm a prophet. I'm saying, I see you in the crowd. Jesus said to Moses, avenge the people of Israel on the Midianites. Now I'm going to go down to verse 17 here. Yeah, you see it there, right? Right here, verse 17. So this is Jesus speaking. Jesus said, kill every male among the little ones. That means like little male babies. And kill every woman who has ever known a man be lying with him. But all the young girls who have not known man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves, Jesus said. Jesus said this. If you're a Trinitarian Christian, you believe this is the word of God. Now, I realize a lot of you Christians don't even believe this is the word of God. This is just man making things up and making your God look bad. But there's a big portion of Christians in the United States who believe this is actually Jesus speaking. So how do you defend this? Jesus saying, basically, kill everybody but the virgin girls. Jesus said, keep the virgin girls alive, but kill everybody else. Are you listening? Let's go down to verse 40. This is interesting. Did you know that Jesus likes to share booty, war booty? Verse 32, now the booty remaining of the spoil that the men of war took was 665,000 sheep and so forth. So this is the Lord speaking to Moses. This is Jesus speaking to Moses. And this verse is what really bothered James White. And in verse 40, Jesus says that the persons were 16,000, of which the Lord's tribute was 32 persons. What does that mean? And Moses gave the tribute, which was the offering for the Lord, as the Lord commanded Moses. What is Jesus talking about here? Jesus is talking about that the spoils of war include some women, virgin women, and Jesus said, give it to the Levites, the temple leaders. This would be like the pastors, the preachers of the day. Jesus is commanding that virgin women be given to them. For what? To clean the temple floors? Now, I think if you love Jesus, you love the Lord, this is problematic for you. This doesn't sit well with you. Now, I think a lot of people will say at this point, well, but so-and-so, like this preacher, this pastor, this apologist, they've looked into this and they're smart and I don't have to think about this anymore. So my job is done. But you can read this for yourself. And you have to somehow, I don't know if you suppress it, if you just like put it in that little corner of your heart, and when it gets full, you just push a little more. I don't know how you deal with this. Now, I know how some people deal with it, who are not Trinitarians or who are, let's say, in the more nuanced Christian. They just deny that God and Jesus had anything to do with this story. But here's the problem if you take that route. If you take that route, then you start to have to question, I think, a lot of things in the Bible. You know, if you're saying, well, man just wrote this to justify actions and you're still a Christian, still a believer, how do you know man's just not writing things in the Gospels to justify certain belief systems? Where does it stop? This is why fundamentalists, even though this is uncomfortable to them, they will keep strong with it because they realize that what I said is true, that it causes a problem for them. At what point do we just say if it's uncomfortable, we stop believing it? If it's comfortable, we do believe it? Of course not. That makes you sound wishy-washy, right? What else do I say? But I'm going to look at some questions on here. What verses am I reading? This is, I was reading from Numbers 31. But for all the young girls who have not known man, by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. Remember, these are the very words of Jesus. Because, right at the top, says, the Lord said to Moses. Jesus said to Moses. And it even repeats that over here. Verse 25, Jesus said to Moses, take count of the booty. So that's where I'm reading from. Reading something out of context ain't doing it justice. Yes. Good point, Jesus Garcia. Whenever you read the Bible, verses from the Bible, you're always taking it out of context, right? Unless you read the whole Bible. And that will take months for me to read the whole Bible. So just assume everything I say is taken out of context. If I say God is love, would you complain I took that out of context? If I read it, or if I read the verse, Jesus wept. Okay, let's see what else is on Frank Turek's channel here. He has like a whole bunch of short clips of answering questions.
Yes, sir. What's your name?
And I haven't watched all of them. Oh, in fact, I have not watched this one, but this one sounds interesting.
Dying as martyrs.
One thing that I've been trying to encourage Christians to do is, I actually think I can make Christian apologists better apologists. I'm really considering starting my own apologetics academy. Because I think that if you don't know how a guy like me would respond to certain questions off the top of your head quickly, I would say you haven't even begun to consider what you believe. But this one's titled, Did the Jews invent the resurrection? Let's see what they have to say.
Yeah, the Jews, obviously, as we talked about earlier, had no motive to invent a resurrected Jesus, right? They believed in a resurrection at the end of time. They didn't think there was going to be individuals resurrected beforehand. And out of all the Christian writers, only one of them is a non-Jew. That's Luke. Why are Jews, who thought they're God's chosen people, inventing this resurrected Jesus and then going and dying for it? I think in Sean's dissertation...
Well, weren't a lot of the Jews Hellenized at that time?
That Jim just mentioned, he says we're very certain about 4, and it wasn't hundreds of years after, by the way, Clement of Rome, talking about in like 95 AD, talks about, I think, Peter and Paul dying as martyrs. We got Peter, Paul, James, and one other one that we're very certain of. I can't think of
it's those 3 that I feel the most
Okay, yeah, about. Peter, Paul, James is mentioned by Josephus and Hegesippus. Josephus is probably in Jerusalem at the time when James dies in 62 AD.
I'm not exactly sure how they got on the topic of martyrdom, but again, if you're a Christian apologist, I would just ask you, okay, what would a guy like me say to the whole concept of martyrdom? Like, very quickly, if you don't know the answer to that, I would say you haven't even begun to understand the reasons for why you believe. And I really don't even think I'm going to answer that question right now because I've answered it so many times.
So we have excellent evidence that the primary apostles died martyrs' deaths because they saw Jesus resurrected from the dead. Now, people will say, well, there are some Muslims that will die for their faith now. Yeah, but they don't have evidence that Islam is true. They have faith, but the New Testament writers were in a position to know whether Jesus had risen from the dead.
Did you hear that? Let me rewind that.
Apostles died martyrs' deaths because they saw Jesus resurrected from the dead. Now, people will say, well, there are some Muslims that will die for their faith now. Yeah, but they don't have evidence that Islam is true. They have faith, but
They don't have evidence that Islam is true. They have faith. But we have evidence.
Testament writers were in a position to know whether Jesus had risen from the dead. They saw Jesus, they touched Jesus, they ate with Jesus, they verified.
How do you know they saw Jesus, they touched Jesus, and they ate with Jesus? Like, these are just very common sense questions. The whole crux of it is that you believe that what's written in the text actually happened. You believe claims that someone saw Jesus, ate with Jesus, talked with Jesus, walked with Jesus after he died and rose again. Now, would you agree, Frank Turek, that actually could be a claim that maybe didn't happen? Do you have reasons to think that maybe it didn't happen? If you can't answer these questions quickly off the top of your head for reasons why maybe it's not historical, you haven't even begun to investigate your beliefs.
That he had been risen from the dead with their own senses.
And one of the things we talked about too, and I think what Stuart, you're talking about, is the early dating of this. So what we kind of do, we say, hey, how early do we think these things are dated? Well, I always argue that there's missing elements in the book of Acts. The no temple destruction in the book of Acts, that happens around 70. No siege of Jerusalem, 67, 68, 69, that's missing. The death of Paul, that's missing.
So I would ask a guy like J. Warner Wallace, what would a guy like me say to the early dating of the Gospels or Acts? And if you can't very, very quickly say, oh, these are the reasons why they're not late dated, boom, 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 boom. If you can't do that, you haven't even begun to study what you believe.
64 to 67, the death of Peter, 64 to 67, the death of James, I put it around 61. All of these things are missing from the book of Acts. So the most reasonable inference is these hadn't happened yet. Because Luke has no problem talking about the death of James, the brother of John, in 44, or about...
Yeah, and Mark doesn't describe the guards at the tomb. So if that really happened, Mark would have talked about guards at the tomb, right, J. Warner Wallace? That means it probably didn't happen yet.
Stephen, but he leaves out the 3 most important players and how they died. So I think we can date Acts to 60. I kind of work backwards, and that gives me great confidence in the first attribute of reliable eyewitness testimony in any jury trial, which is Was the witness really there to see what he said he saw? That means...
Was the witness really there to say that he really saw something? I think this is why apologetics is going to come back to bite itself on the butt, because there's going to be Christians who will just listen to J. Warner Wallace right now and just eat it up. And they're going to learn, if they do any study, they're going to learn the other side of the story, that maybe there weren't 4 eyewitnesses called the Gospels. Maybe they were written at a time where it's most likely they were dead. Maybe anybody who could have said anything against the Gospels, 9 out of 10 of them were dead. Maybe it was written in Rome or in Antioch, close to 1,000 miles away from the purported events, where anybody who could have spoke against it was dead. Maybe not everything in the Gospels is historical fact. Maybe some of it is propaganda. Maybe some of it is just simply parable. For a guy like Warner Wallace to claim to be, I believe him, a detective, he would never, ever use this type of evidence to convict someone of murder. This type of eyewitness testimony where we don't even, their names are not on it, the dates are not on it, where they wrote it's not on it.
If these aren't dated early, we can't even begin. These were written early enough to have been written by eyewitnesses, but more importantly, to be vetted by those who would have known if it's a lie. And that gives me great confidence, because that doesn't mean it's true yet. It's just one aspect of witness reliability.
Yeah, and if someday, J. Warner Wallace, you got to be careful now. If J. Warner Wallace, if you ever watch this video, you have to be very careful now, because if someday you become convinced that the Gospels were written late, let's say post 70 AD, you've just admitted you have to lower your confidence in Christianity that it's true. You're kind of in a stuck position right now, because you are basing a lot of this eyewitness testimony on the early dating, that if you become convinced that that's not the case, I have a feeling you're basically doomed to leaving Christianity.
But it's the first bridge I have to cross with the witness before I ever use them in trial. And these authors can cross the first bridge.
The New Testament writers did not create the resurrection. The resurrection created the New Testament writers. There'd be no New Testament if it wasn't for a resurrection.
Oh, wow. There would be no New Testament without the resurrection. Just hang on a second. Sorry, my wife's making lunch in the background. I know you can hear it. The microwave's going off. Let me replay what he just said, and let's put an analogy to it here.
And these authors can cross the first bridge.
The New Testament writers did not create the resurrection. The resurrection created the New Testament writers. There'd be no New Testament if it wasn't for a resurrection.
It's good.
What would be a good outsider test for faith on that one? There would be no Gabriel talking to Muhammad in a cave if it actually didn't happen. The Quran would never have said that Gabriel talked to Muhammad in a cave if it actually didn't happen, right? That's just common sense. There would be no resurrection. There would be no resurrection if the Bible didn't say so. The Bible says there's a resurrection because it happened. Which is more likely to you? This is the key fundamental difference in epistemologies, is that what's more likely question. If you have no skin in the game, if, like Ravi Zacharias said, if you don't have this sort of desperation feeling that, oh, I can't explain this, so this has to be God. If you're just coming at it without any bias, and you ask yourself the what's more likely question, that Gabriel actually talked to Muhammad in the cave, an angel named Gabriel actually talked to Muhammad in the cave, or the Quran just says that happened and maybe he didn't, I think it's very easy for the Christian to say, oh, yeah, no, it's just more likely a book says it and it didn't happen. What's more likely, that Jesus rose from the dead in bodily form, or a book just says that happened? Now, phrased that way, it's a no-brainer, right? Christians hate this when I say it this way, but if you value truth, it's almost rhetorical. You would say, well, of course, it's more likely that the book just says so. But Doug, you got to look at all the eyewitnesses. Well, we don't have eyewitnesses. We have people claiming they're eyewitnesses who don't state who they are. But we have archaeological evidence. But couldn't some things in the Bible be true, like people, places, just like there's people and places in the Quran that have been verified through archaeological evidence? But Doug, we have prophecies. Yeah, but why is it that that people who knew the prophecies the best at that time didn't see them as Jesus being the fulfillment of those prophecies? Why can't the Jews see them? Why can't secular people see them? Why can't Muslims see them? Why is it only that those who are already in the belief can see these prophecies? But yeah, Doug, we have changed lives. Well, people's lives have been radically changed in other religions. Why do you say that? And you don't say that what they attribute those changes to is true. Why would we say that Jesus changed your life? Maybe something else caused the change in your life, like it's just the strong belief that it's true without it actually being true. My goodness. It's almost like I feel sorry for these apologists. Like I feel like I need to help them. There was one other, I don't know if I should get into this, but there was one podcast that I listened to today on why Christians are leaving Christianity. And let's see if I can find it here quickly. But what do you guys think is the biggest reason why Christians leave Christianity? Do you think it's because they were hurt in the church? If you think that, I think you're wrong. Do you think it's because people see hypocrites in the church? If you think that, I think you're wrong. I think the Pew studies are pretty clear on this question. And I think one of the main reasons, now what I just said, sure, some people leave the church because of hypocrites or they've been hurt by the church and so forth. But I think the main reason why a lot of Christians leave Christianity is because they don't believe it anymore. They've become unconvinced. And they just basically, the core propositions, they don't believe. And I think a lot of Christian apologists get this wrong. They think that they just haven't seen the love, or they really don't know the true Jesus, or they really don't understand the nature of God properly. No, there's people who have been pastors and preachers who've loved Jesus, who have converted people, who have baptized people. They understand Christianity, and they left. Why? Because they stopped believing it was actually true. And there was an interesting podcast today, Think Biblically, with Sean McDowell and Scott Ray. And I don't know how much of this I'm going to play, but I thought it was very, very revealing.
Welcome to the podcast, Think Biblically, Conversations on Faith and Culture. I'm your host, Scott Ray.
In their faith. Can you briefly tell us your story? Why did you come to believe and have faith in the first place?
Well, that's nice to be on with you, gentlemen, Scott and Sean. Appreciate this a lot. Listen, I have a great story. I mean, I was raised in a home with two wonderful parents. Both loved Jesus very much and were very consistent in the way they lived it out. It was really a great home. We had a lot of fun. My parents were my dad could be stern at times, but he had a good sense of humor as well. We did a lot of fun things together. And as I got to be a little older, I heard the Christian, and I saw the Christian faith lived out in a very consistent, wonderful way. And I always hoped it was true. I loved the message, to tell you the truth, even though I had a few years in there when I turned.
Okay, so this is Think Biblically podcast with Sean McDowell, Scott Ray, and the person talking now is, what's his name? I'll find it.
Away from it. But at about 17 or 18 years old, at 16 years old, I made a commitment to the Lord. I got down on my knees in my bedroom one day and I said, I want to follow you. I want to put my life in this direction. I want to be a follower of Jesus for the rest of my life. And I made that prayer, I made that commitment. Well, in about a year or two, I felt like I had this assault of just major questions coming at me. How do I know this whole thing is true? And what if I'd been raised in a different kind of home? And then I suppose I'd believe those ideas just like I believe these ones.
Okay, so he's basically telling his testimony where he decided at age, what did he say, 16, he would commit himself to Christianity, and then later on he had doubts. So this is exactly what I've been saying for years, and this is a pattern I see in all religions, that you were born and raised in it, and in your late teens, early 20s, you start to question it, doubt it, you do your research, and once you know, the religion that you were born into happened to be the right one all along.
Now, and the whole thing was just really throwing me into a tizzy, and I remember going to the most respected Christian man in our town, asking him for a meeting and sitting down with him and laying this thing out for him because I really didn't know where to go with it. And I still remember his answer today. He said, you know what you got to do, Paul? You got to get down on your knees. You got to ask God to take those doubts away. And then he said with his great big smile, and you got to stay at that chair till those doubts are gone. And then that's it, right there. And I got up and I thought, boy, that was not nearly as helpful as I hoped it was.
That was
and
it?
I just think that was it. That was his answer right
gosh.
there. And so by the grace of God, somehow those things went into the back of my mind. In a short time, I was attending a Bible college, and I was signed up because everybody had to take a course called Christian Foundations, which I didn't even know what that was, but I heard it was a course in apologetics. And I began reading a book called More Than a Carpenter by your father, Sean. Yeah, that
awesome.
book. It was great. Another one by Paul Little called No.
See, this is the problem, though. If you value truth, if you're really wanting to believe true things, and you're a Christian, do you go to a Christian college to find truth? And only there? And do you take Christian classes? And do you take Christian apologetics to find truth if you're a Christian? It's the same. Think about a Muslim really trying to figure out if what he believes is true. And this Muslim goes to some type of Muslim college and takes Muslim apologetics. And wouldn't you know, that Muslim comes out thinking they're more convinced, not all of them, but a lot of them are just more convinced that Islam is true.
Why You Believe. I began listening to some audio tapes by John Warwick Montgomery, something by C.S. Lewis. And the very fact that people were even asking the questions I was asking was a huge encouragement to me. And I began to find one by one there were answers to my questions, and something flipped about a year later in my mind, where rather than just always doubting whether this whole thing was true, a confidence was developed. So that now I thought, okay, if there's more questions, which of course there are, I bet there's answers to those ones as well.
I bet there's answers to those questions as well. So here's a man who had questions when he was in his late teens, early 20s, and wouldn't you know it, there was an answer for every question he had. This happens in I think almost every religion. They have questions. They seriously doubt whether this is true. Seek and ye shall find, and that's what happens. The Muslim seeks out answers, and wouldn't you know, there's an answer to every question they have. The Mormon has doubts, they seek out answers, and wouldn't you know it, the Mormon has answers to every question. Hinduism, Buddhism. This is a pattern.
It was a huge, huge change for me. And from then on, I've never, ever looked back. I went on to theological seminary. William Lane Craig was my professor there in apologetics.
Ooh, so this guy is a student of William Lane Craig.
and he's been a good friend and a support and encouragement to me. And I had a chance to work with Ravi Zacharias for some time as well. And as I got older, my whole life has moved more toward Christian apologetics because it's been so meaningful to me. And I find there's others out there too, not everybody, but others asking the same kinds of questions as I have. And it's wonderful to be working in this field. But that's a little bit of my story.
Thanks, Paul. That's a helpful background, and I think it makes a lot more sense.
Helpful background. So basically, born and raised in a Christian home, had some doubts, went to Bible school, seminary, took apologetics, firm believer.
That's why the book project was so motivating to you. You maintain in the book that there's a new kind of critic of Christianity today.
Oh, I have a feeling the new type of critic of Christianity today is going to be talking about me. Here we go.
Who are these new critics? I mean, who are the people that you're talking about here?
Well, the people I'm talking about are people who have used to worship right alongside the rest of us. And at some point along the way, for various reasons, found some reason in their heart to walk away. And they become people who are very passionate. In many cases, passionate. They're a different kind of critic in the sense that they're well informed. They know their Bible, their theology, their church history often better than most Christians. And in some cases, they were leaders among us. They were pastors.
Me and my wife, we were Sunday school leaders for the youth ministry when I went to church.
Theologians, Sunday school teachers, seminary graduates. Some of them have been pastors 10, 20, 30 years. I mean, it really kind of blows my mind when I think about it. What I find happening with these critics is not only are their objections often very precise and very pointed, but they receive a lot of credibility from our society because, unlike other critics, they were actually in the group. They're now critiquing, and so who could know it better than they?
Yeah, we were in the group, but of course, the common refrain, and I don't know if this is coming up, if you'll say this, but the common refrain as well, they weren't true Christians to begin with.
And it's kind of like we all give more credibility to people who are, say, ex-Mormons or ex-Muslims or ex-communists or ex-just about anything because they were in those groups. And so that's the kind of critic I'm talking about. And I came across it the very first time. What really motivated me to write this book was from a young man, a friend of mine, who was a very fine Christian man and quite well trained as well. But he had a colleague at work who was just in exactly this situation, and he sat down with him for an entire weekend one time because they were sent on a project together to work on. He sat down with him to share his own faith and ask him questions. Well, in a very short time, this young man had taken care of all his comments and then all his questions, and then began with a litany of his own objections, bombarded my friend with it for the entire weekend. And it was my friend that came home with a faith crisis. It was incredible what this did. And I shared this with a pastor friend of mine, and he just said, that story gives me the willies. I just wonder how many people in my church, whether they would do any better than your friend there. And as I shared with other pastors and began looking around, I just began to see a wave of this happening. And then people I knew, it happened to some of them as well.
Okay, so here's a guy. This, by the way, this is hot off the press. I just saw this tweeted out by Sean McDowell today. But here's a guy admitting, I think he's an apologist, definitely, but I don't know if he's a pastor as well. But he's admitting that Christians are getting smoked. They're getting clobbered from guys like me who actually know the Bible, who lived it for decades, and they're coming home with their faith shaken.
One young man I used to ask questions to myself because he was so bright. His knowledge of the Bible was so sharp. Now he's written a book saying how he's become an atheist, and he's debunking Christianity with his entire life. And he's well trained as a pastor and teacher as well before that. And that's what really motivated me. I thought something's really serious here, and it really deeply concerned me. And then I received...
Why does it deeply concern you? This is a question, a very fundamental question that I ask Christians. And I think I know the answer, but I love to hear them articulate it. Like, why does it concern you when people leave Christianity? And I think there's only two main reasons. And I'm not sure depending on the person, which one outweighs the other. But I think the first reason is because they don't want to see people going to hell or not going to heaven, however you want to look at it. And the second reason is they honestly believe that if people leave Christianity, society will go down the road of moral decay. Even though the evidence points into the opposite direction, at least on many metrics, like crime, abortion, just well-being of people. You look at European countries that have a lot of better care, that have lower crime. Even in the United States, the abortion rate's been plummeting, crime rates have been going down as Christianity has been going down with it.
A lot of encouragement to write, but that's the kind of person, and it seemed like it's a different kind of critic than we've had before.
So, Paul, let's cut right to the chase on this. Why do people, like this audience you're addressing, why do people stop believing?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I really wrestled with that, and when I began looking at the kind of people who did, I actually tried to put them in some categories, and I found it very difficult. Their stories were so different. But your question, why do they leave? There are a number of patterns you begin to see. Some of them are just maybe old-fashioned ones, personal disappointment with Christians, the church, God himself. Some people tell these stories are fairly deep. Maybe they've had a personal failure in some cases, coupled with the difficulty of finding acceptance later. They feel like they're being now treated differently. People now doubt them, treat them like maybe some damaged goods. And this is all part of a complex. It just begins sending them in a bit of a different direction.
Yeah, I don't know if guys like this gentleman want that to be true because they think that's easier fixed. Come on, Christian, just treat others better and this will stop. Just love your fellow man better and your fellow Christians better and they won't leave. No, this is not going to help. And here's why. Guys like me, I really didn't care what other Christians thought of me. And I think the people who do leave Christianity tend to be the ones who, not always, but tend to be the ones who are willing to step out of the in-group. They have different values, let's say, that they think that, it's better to believe what's true than just belong to a community who believe false things. And I'm not saying you can actually, I actually believe there's a lot of people in the church who don't believe hardly any of it and just are there for the community. And so I think that they think that just by being a better example and not being hypocrites or loving others, that will help prevent Christians from leaving. But this is not the case at all, I don't believe. In fact, I think that if you're going to play the example game, Christians will lose every time it's tried. And I think even Christians realize this. I think they realize that being a good example, loving others, doesn't help them see the truth of Jesus. Now, for some, that's probably the case. I admit that. But for a lot, and in fact, I'd say most, I've known so many kind, caring people of integrity who are Muslim, Mormon. I haven't known too many Hindus in my life, but I've talked to a few. There are people in different belief systems who behave better than you, Mr. and Mrs. Christian. And so this whole idea of treating people better is not going to safeguard people leaving Christianity or even entering it.
In some cases, I know there's simply what I would have to call unrealistic expectations from God, from the Christian faith. Maybe the teaching they received was.
Whoa! This is huge. He's saying that one of the reasons why people leave Christianity is because of unrealistic expectations of their God, of Jesus. You understand what's going on here? And I think he's right, though. I think if you look at the statistics, a lot of Pentecostals leave Christianity and become atheists. And why is that? And I think it's because Pentecostals and people who are more charismatic, those end-time type people who think that Jesus is going to come next year, and when their expectations are crushed over and over and over again, those are the ones who are more likely to leave Christianity, I think. The Christians who honestly, sincerely believe that by laying hands on people, you can heal broken bones. Those are the people who are more likely to leave Christianity. So if you're a Christian and you want to stay in Christianity, keep your expectations of your God low.
was not properly balanced. As one man said who had been a pastor, now he said, I stopped believing in God altogether because I ran out of excuses for God. And as a pastor, he believed and he taught others that God would answer their prayers and protect them and others from harm and give him wisdom and strength and provide an abundance of all the things he needed, all those kinds of things, he said. He says, over time, there were just too many disappointments. I found the same things were happening to me as were happening to everybody else, other friends who were non-believers.
Yeah, like but this goes against one of the reasons why I think Christians are so concerned when other Christians leave the faith, leave Christianity, is because they think society will go down into moral decay. But yet he's admitting here that it rains on the good and bad equally, that good things and bad things happen to whether you're a Christian or non-Christian. In other words, people make mistakes equally, no matter what religion you're in. People make mistakes. I used to think, oh, if only they had Jesus, they wouldn't have all these problems in their life. No, there's really sincere Christians out there who their lives are nothing but problems.
He says, so then I began making excuses. He called these the fine point of his theology. And anyway, as time went on, it really made me think. Are we teaching in our churches? Is our teaching balanced? Are we over-promising on God's behalf?
Yeah, don't over-promise on God's behalf.
Putting God in a position where unless he delivers on our promises on his behalf, then we're leading people to entertain these doubts of his good character and of his existence. And it really made me question a lot of things. But that's and then, of course, in addition to that, there's intellectual difficulties certain people have in the whole variety of these things. But some of them are pretty difficult, the way they put them, and we have to work on those very carefully. But one really key reason, I experienced this when I was involved in an atheist convention myself. I was debating one of the people there as the convention opened up.
Yeah, someone asked, what's my background? Yeah, I was born and raised Mennonite, but I kind of left being a Mennonite. Mennonite is an Anabaptist belief that split off in the 1600s, that believed in pacifism, and that turned the other cheek that Jesus commanded was not just for people personally, but also for government. So, but I've been in, I think, close to 10 denominations in my life, like seriously been in them. So I think I have a well-rounded view of all the different versions of Protestant Christianity. And as this convention got closer, people would ask me, different Christian friends and non-Christian friends as well, why would atheists come together? Well, what do they have to celebrate? Nothingness, and this would draw quite a laugh, And I said, well, let me find out when I get there. Well, in no time at all when I got there. Okay, so this guy goes to some atheist convention, I think he said. What do they have to come together? That's a good question. I think being an atheist just means you don't believe in any gods. But other than that, you can't say anything. There's no tenets of atheism. You can be an atheist and not a naturalist. You can be an atheist, and I just say this because of the country I live in, the United States. You can be an atheist and a full-fledged Trump supporter. There's this conception that all atheists, or most atheists, are Democrats, for example. To say you're an atheist doesn't say much. And granted, to say you're a Christian doesn't say much either. You can be a Christian and, like I said, think that the Old Testament is just a bunch of fairy tales.
I found a huge number of the people there were not merely atheists, but they were ex-something or other. Ex-Southern Baptists, ex-Mormons, ex-Catholics, something like that. And they were there to celebrate their newfound freedom. And there seemed to be a real desire on their part to think freely, free from all restrictions, and as far as...
Yes, Brian, I agree. Well, one thing that's very common amongst atheists, especially in the United States, is the separation of church and state.
They were concerned, Christians value and follow evidence. They say they do, but at the end of the day, their views must conform to the Bible. And if you want to be free to think for yourself, you've got to throw it all off. And they get out and they start these organizations like Free Thought Society and Project Reason, Center for Inquiry, and things like that. And this seems to be something that really resonates in this community. They've freed themselves from the shackles of religion, and you hear this again and again and again.
But I think a lot of Christians would agree with that sentiment, to free yourself from the shackles of religion. Isn't it Christians themselves saying religion is bad, but personal relationship with Jesus is good?
And it really has made me think about this. It raised the question: does Christianity do that? Like, what is our response to that? Because it's a huge underlying motive I found.
I'm curious how you balance the relational and kind of the truth aspect. And what I mean by that is often I hear apologists say kids leave the faith because they don't have answers. But then I also read a big study coming out of Fuller Theological Seminary by Kara Powell, and they cited hundreds of students. They said kids who walked away from their faith didn't have a genuine experience of grace.
Oh, how many ex-Christians in the chat right now are kind of vomiting in their mouth a little bit. Christians who leave Christianity didn't have the genuine experience of grace. They didn't know who the God of the universe really was. They didn't experience the love of Jesus really. It's basically what Sean McDowell is saying right now is, man, they say they were Christians, but they're lying. Maybe they're not lying, but they're mistaken. They were ignorant of the true Christianity. I think the evidence speaks to themselves. Like, look at guys like Dan Barker. Like, if he was listening to this right now, he would be throwing up and saying, look, Sean McDowell, you would not have known the difference between me and you back in the heyday. He was on fire for God.
And it seems to me that it's both. How do you balance that relational side as well as the truth apologetic side?
Boy, I'll tell you, that is such a good question, Sean. It comes up in my courses all the time. And you know what? You just work at that. And what sometimes I get more help from my students I teach graduate level students, so they bring a lot of experience to the classroom. But they will tell me, and I would just affirm that every time, you've got to ask a lot of questions. The biggest question you have to ask is, why? I always encourage it when you meet someone who walked away from the faith. First question, if you get into their lives and earn the right to ask this question, why did you leave? What exactly were you rejecting when you walked away?
I find it interesting that he frames it that way. What exactly are you rejecting? And the reason why he's framing it this way, this is my guess, is because he's hoping that the ex-Christian will paint a picture of a God that he doesn't believe in either. But really, I think, I'll speak for myself. The reason why, what I'm rejecting is the core propositions of Christianity, what Christianity really is, which I think a lot of Christians agree is the resurrection of Jesus Christ for atonement, for redemption, for the sins of the world.
Was it a teaching, or was it the God who loves you, or was it something about the church, or why did you leave? Because this has to be balanced, because we can go off and give a really long intellectual answer to somebody for whom that is not even the issue. Maybe they need someone to care. Maybe they need someone to introduce. Teach them a little more about what the grace of God really could mean in their lives. You just have this balance is really critical. It's a little bit like, of course, when we encounter with somebody who suffered a very difficult experience, a problem of evil in their life. We need to ask, does this person need an intellectual response, or do they need a very caring, loving, kind response? What do they need here? And it depends where we're at. And this is something we have. We need the wisdom of Solomon to do this carefully, but we need to pray for that.
Yeah, it's I don't know if I should be offended by that or thankful for that answer, as far as we just need to, it's almost like we just need to give Doug a hug. He's probably been through some rough times in his life, and we can't understand, the emotional baggage that he has from being raised Mennonite, and the legalism that he was taught as a child. And can you really blame Doug for leaving that type of Christianity? And if only we could just get Doug to if we could build up enough credit that Doug would actually listen to who the real Jesus is, that he loves him deeply. I know this is what a lot of Christians are thinking, but no, I don't believe the core propositions of the belief. It's as simple as that.
I love what you said in terms of finding out what the real issue is.
Yeah.
I wrote a blog a while ago saying answering the question behind the question, because normally when you ask someone why they left the faith, they'll give intellectual reasons. But I'm really skeptical that that's really what it is. So how do you get to the heart of the issue? And
Okay, why do I get flack when I make a comment like that? But Sean McDowell, like, Mike Winger, are you listening? Is this thing on? Mike Winger came on the other day and kind of gave me a rough time because I will look at the emotional, the psychological drivers of what causes bias, how we view the evidence. And basically, Sean McDowell is saying the same thing here. And but I have a feeling he'll get a pass and I'll just constantly get harassed for it.
People even really understand why they stopped believing in the first place.
Well, you know what? Those are all really hard questions in there. We can't get anywhere without having some good, deep conversations if people are willing to allow us. But when you say there should be an answer behind the stated one, I think that's often the case. And here's the interesting thing. I have some students often saying, well, that person told me, they gave me a reason, but I didn't believe them. I think that's just a smokescreen. So my question is, okay, then what did you do then? What happened then? And often they leave it at that. And my response to them all the time is, well, if you're right about that, if there really is something back behind then what is that? Because there's something that has driven them away, whatever that may be.
Okay, so he's saying that the Christian has a question, doesn't understand something. He goes to a fellow Christian or pastor, preacher, apologist, gets an answer, doesn't suffice, and they kind of just slowly walk away. And this guy is saying, "Oh, why did they put his name on here?" My good, Paul Chamberlain. Thank you. There it is. It's right at the top. So Paul Chamberlain's saying that, well, why did you stop there? Like, why did you? One answer you got didn't suffice for you, and then you walk away. Like you keep searching, you keep looking for an answer until you find it. It's almost like that's what he's saying. But I think if you value truth, you seek the answers that go against what you believe as much as you seek the answers that go for it. And I think that for me is why I can be confident that I didn't leave Christianity for an emotional reason. I basically said to myself, okay, I make a claim about Christianity, and a person who's not a Christian is about to say something back to me. In fact, I see Stickman Sam is in the chat, and this happened exactly today. Until you can come to the point in your belief system where you know exactly why, or can predict fairly confidently what the person who disagrees with you will say, and know the arguments against what you believe, you haven't even begun to delve into the reasons why you believe. You haven't even started. If you can't quickly know all the reasons why you shouldn't believe something, and I think this is prevalent in apologetics today. Some guys are great at it, but I think most Christians, they haven't even started with this.
So can we somehow get back and say, well, if this really isn't it, could there be something more? But how do you get back there? Because the risk we actually run here is if the person gives us a stated reason, whatever that may be, and we immediately try to get past it and say, well, I don't think that's the real reason. I think there's probably something else going on. I actually saw that done once in a conversation I was a part of with a group of us, and the person who had walked away from the faith was really deeply offended by that. His response was, oh, I see. So nothing could be wrong with your view. You're just telling me that I didn't look hard enough or I didn't think hard enough. How do you know how hard I thought? How do you know how do you know how hard I looked? He said, I just find that offensive. So I thought, well, we need to be very wise in how we go about this. I learned from that experience. I still think there may be something back behind there, but...
Yeah, point taken. And I could be guilty of doing the same thing to Christians. But what I try to do is say, hey, look, is it at least possible that I left Christianity for just emotional reasons and really bad reasons? But on the same token, is it possible you entered Christianity for emotional reasons, for comfort reasons, and maybe not good reasons? Let's put all that on the table and let's just pretend we're Spock for a few minutes and seriously try as best we can to look at the evidence objectively.
Sometimes you have to deal with the issue they give, and then you're able to say, that really isn't your issue, is it? Isn't there something deeper going on here? But you have to earn the right to ask those kinds of questions, I think, but I do think that's where we need to try to get to.
Paul, in your book, you use the term that you describe what you call the changing face of atheism.
Yeah, right.
That atheism, as it's presenting itself today, does so differently than it did a generation ago. How has that changed?
Well, that's such a great question. That's why I devoted a chapter to this, as you saw in there. It's something that.
This is going to go into a discussion of the new atheists.
I came across in a particular debate I was in with a person who had been a Christian before, it came down to there's 2 or 3 steps going on here. First of all, I began to realize right off the bat, this is where I first encountered this directly, was a shifting of the burden of proof fully over to the theist. And of course, that's not really new. That's been around for a little while. But then what I began to realize, so in other words, so the atheist has no case to make. The case of the burden of proof is purely on the theist to make his or her case. But
I don't want to get into the whole thing about burden of proof, but Christians listening, you do realize there's there's beliefs in thousands of gods out there. Yeah, Doug, of course there's people who believe in different gods. Okay. So it's not just theism versus atheism per se. It's, in this case, Paul Chamberlain, it's Christianity and atheism. Now, before he even says anything else, I'm going to say this. I am willing to take the burden of proof for Christianity to say that that is probably false. I'm willing to take the burden. I'm willing to claim that Christianity is probably false. I still admit I could be wrong, but I'm willing to defend that claim. I'm willing to do that. But would I do that with a religion I've never even heard of? Of course not. I truly have a lack of belief there because I have no idea what it is, what the evidence is, what it's all about. So with atheism and burden of proof, atheism is just the lack of belief in all gods. But on certain gods, some atheists can say, yes, I claim that God is false, and I'm willing to defend it and show you my reasons why. But to say as a blanket, no, you would have to be omniscient to make the claim there is no God. And this is why I actually rail against atheists who will say definitely there's no God of any sort, because you'd almost have to be omniscient to claim that. Now, I think you can get close and say, you're very confident there is no God. But it very well may be the case that the God exists, that's a hidden God, wants to be hidden, but maybe in the year 2100 will reveal him or her or itself to mankind.
But then, of course, you go the next step. Some atheists have gone the next step by finding sophisticated ways of making that case, the case that the burden of proof belongs entirely to the theist. So now, rather than giving any arguments to try to show that even atheism is true, it's often conceded up front. This can't even...
I still get kind of, I don't know what to say when I hear that phrase, atheism is true or atheism is false. Is the core beliefs of Christianity true or false? But what's the core belief? Well, the core belief that there is no God, that's just a belief. It's not making a knowledge claim. And this is, I think philosophers understand this, but the average Joe on the street doesn't, that you can say you believe something, and because your confidence might be low or high, depending on your confidence levels, then it moves to whether you know it or whether you're just guessing. And so there has to be that distinction made between knowledge and belief when it comes to burden of proof.
Can be done. You spend your whole time giving arguments to try to show that there is no burden of proof on the atheist at all. And then you come up with some fairly ingenious ways of making that case. Here's how it happened in in my case. After the person made this case on, and I kind of pressed him as best I could. Can you give us any reasons for thinking atheism is true? I couldn't get even a single one.
Yeah, and I got a lot of flack when I made a video a while back that's titled, and if you haven't watched it, you can watch it. I made a video titled, "There Are No Good Reasons for Atheism." And I did that on purpose for guys like Paul Chamberlain. I'm willing to meet with Paul Chamberlain face to face and admit, yeah, there's no good reasons for atheism. Well, then why are you an atheist, Doug? Well, okay, let's go through all the options for theism, shall we? And at the end of the day, when I don't find any of the theistic religions of the world or belief systems of the world convincing, and I just can't force myself to believe it, as William Lane Craig says, he just can't believe being a Roman Catholic, so he just doesn't believe it. He doesn't believe the core propositions of Roman Catholicism, so that's why he can't be a Catholic. I just don't believe all the various religions of the world. So what am I? Now, if you just want to call me an agnostic, fine. You can call me whatever you want, but I don't live my life like it's true.
We were about 20, 30, 40 minutes into the debate by that time. So then we had the cross-examination. So I simply said, can I just confirm here, clarify with you? Are you telling us the burden of proof is always and only on the person making the positive truth claim, namely the theist here? And I was really precise in how I said it. I thought he would actually back off a little, but he said, yes, that's what I'm saying. I said, can I give you an example of a negative claim, and you tell me whether you think there's any burden of proof on the person making that claim. And so I said, my negative claim is this: the Holocaust did not happen. So then the person said this back to me. He says, well, if I say I believe the Holocaust did not happen, I would have a burden of proof. So he's backing off a little on that claim. But then he said, but if I merely say I don't believe the Holocaust did happen, then I have no burden of proof because I'm not claiming anything. I just don't believe. You're the one who does believe something. I don't believe something. So now we have a little bit of a change in how atheism is even being presented, and that's what complicated things. The shifting of the burden of proof and a little bit of changing of the definition of atheism, actually blurring it with agnosticism.
Blurring it with that. They're not they're not mutually exclusive, Paul Chamberlain. Agnosticism has to do with knowledge, and beliefs have to do with, I guess, your confidence in certain propositions. You can believe your favorite baseball team's going to win next week, but do you know it? Of course not, unless you can see the future. I recommend you avoid these terms altogether and just use the words "I'm not convinced" or "I don't live my life like it's true." And that's all you have to do.
And as I began to realize, like when I shared that with my students, they said right off the bat, well, that's just a game. We can play that game too. We could just say, we just don't believe there is no God. So there's no burden of proof on us. It's on you, the atheist, because now you do believe there is no God. And everybody had a bit of a laugh about it. And it's kind of a silly game on that one level. But the issue becomes a little deeper, and I think we have to really learn how to track with this. I think we have to really press the point here and say, when you say you believe, you just don't believe there is a God. Do you also not believe there is no God? In other words, you just don't believe either way. You don't believe there is a God, or you don't believe there is not a God. Because if the answer to that is yes, then this is just old-fashioned agnosticism. But on the other hand,
yeah, I'm very curious what Paul Chamberlain would call me. So if PineCreek Doug says, I don't believe in any gods, I don't say there can't be one, there might be one, I'm not omniscient, who knows, I don't live my life like any gods exist. What am I, Paul Chamberlain? Am I an atheist? Am I just an agnostic? Why can't I be both? Because when I say I don't believe, that means I'm an atheist, right? But when I say that there could be a God, does that make me an agnostic now? Why not just, I think it's better off just to use these short sentences to explain those terms rather than just use the terms and have people assume.
Person does believe there is not a God, then they're back to the original statement, which even they've admitted requires the burden of proof. And that's the kind of the thinking I had to do to work it through. But I really found it can be very confusing, it can be quite frustrating, but the point is, if it's allowed to be successful, It shifts the entire way the discussion is handled, because now the atheist has really nothing to do.
Yeah, I kind of feel sorry for Christians. Sorry, there's my Canadian accent. I feel sorry for Christians here because I agree with Paul Chamberlain that it seems like they're always doing the work, and at some point they just get tired. And but they're the ones who are living their life and are sad when people leave. So I am willing, personally, a lot of atheists probably disagree with me on this one, but if a Christian approaches me, I am willing to take the burden as well in the other side. And I think actually that helps the conversation, takes some of the pressure off them. So they're a lot of them just hate, why are you always asking the questions and I never get to ask questions? But the thing is, when they ask me questions about general theism, or specific claims of what I believe and how that impacts my life and so forth, they're going to be disappointed because I'm not very dogmatic on very few. I'm only dogmatic on like things that are repeatable, like things falling to the ground when you let go, and that the earth revolves about the sun and so forth. I'm willing to say I don't know on things I truly don't know about.
But just sit back and listen to the arguments for the theist and just say, I don't find those convincing, and fall back into his default position, which is atheism. But then atheism is now redefined as well to almost be making no claim. It's very much blurred with agnosticism. And that's what I found going on, and that's why I found the debating to be much more a job of trying to clarify concepts and then finally bring out the fact that you're giving no reasons.
So if you're an atheist out there listening to this, my opinion, my advice is be okay with calling yourself an agnostic, and that's it, to a Christian like Paul Chamberlain. Because then you kind of, all this confusion, and you probably waste hours talking about burden of proof, I think just evaporates.
To believe atheism is true. So I'm not sure. That's a little bit complex, but that's what I have encountered.
Paul, I'm curious if you can comment on this.
Yeah.
I've been blogging 2 or 3 times a week for almost 3 years. So out of 300 or 400 blogs, one of the top 5, maybe even higher than that, is a blog I called "Why Do Kids Leave the Faith? Don't Forget Bad Theology." And I made the point that in all of my experience, when I talk with somebody, at the heart of it, I find some misunderstanding about the faith.
For guys like Sean McDowell, it's just inconceivable to him that someone could understand Christianity better than him and still not believe it. Like, it's just like, how is this possible? This does not compute. How could it be that it can't be true that they understand Christianity more than me and yet still reject it, can it? Well, if you're a Calvinist listening, you say, of course, they don't have the Holy Spirit in them. They don't have the special sauce, the X factor. Of course, they're not going to believe it.
God enjoys just judging people, that God just wants to send somebody to hell, that it's this harsh, vindictive God, or some broken theology. Is that true in your experience? What do you think about that?
Well, yes, I think that's very true. I maybe not in every case, but I think it certainly is true in some cases, because when you read about why people have left, they come up with these pictures of God, these presentations of God, usually something about God, that is just, I'm reading it and I'm scratching my head and saying, that is not the God that I see in the Bible.
That's not the God I see in the Bible. Paul Chamberlain or Sean McDowell, if you ever watch this video, there's... earlier in this video, I actually played some clips from Frank Turek's channel. Let me ask you, is the Jesus you worship and serve, is it the one who commanded the killing of men, women, and children, except for the virgin girls? Is that the God you worship and serve? Or do you reject that part of the Bible? Do you believe that the God you worship and serve at one time in history said that? Paul Chamberlain, do you believe that at one time the God, Jesus, that you worship and serve, at one time said you may buy slaves from the nations around you? I'm not asking the reasons behind it. I'm not asking you to explain yourself. All I'm saying, do you believe that or not? And And if you're tempted to say, well, but that made lives better because those people would have died if they wouldn't have been slaves. And yeah, but now we have a God that grades morality on some type of cultural curve, do we not? When this God could have said, don't have slaves. Don't own them for property as life. Why don't you guys start some type of democracy? Because 2,000 years from now, mankind will have figured out some type of democracy or system of separation of church and state where people are free to make their own mistakes and so forth and vote people in power instead. Seems to work. Seems to lower some violence compared to biblical times, Old Testament times.
Like, where did we get this notion of God? Or that's not, or something about, as I mentioned before, the expectations that we should have coming from the Bible about what God will do, or the right thinking about prayer, or the right thinking about faith, or or what we should expect God.
Yeah, even if you're a touchy-feely Christian, Paul Chamberlain, are you saying that if someone has cancer, fourth stage lung cancer or something, and they pray that God will heal them, that they shouldn't expect that to happen? Is that what you're saying, Paul Chamberlain? Paul Chamberlain, are you saying a Christian father whose daughter is dying of bone cancer, and they pray that God will heal them, that they shouldn't expect that God will do that? Are you saying you purposely want Christians to lower their expectations of God so they're not disappointed, so they don't leave Christianity, so they don't end up in hell?
Well, will do. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, this is just a case where we need some much more clear and accurate teaching from the Bible about what the faith really is, because that's where I get back to this question, why exactly did you leave? What exactly were you rejecting? And I'm always hoping we can get to the bottom of it. And if
I'm rejecting the proposition that a man died and rose again for my sins. I'm rejecting that proposition. I'm rejecting that a God created the universe as described in the book of Genesis. That's what I'm rejecting. Now, is this the God that you worship and serve or not? I think it is. So I'm rejecting your God, not some made-up God that you don't believe in either.
There's something about a misconception about God. I'd like to see if we could get at it by asking that question. I'm not sure if that fits with your experience or not, Sean.
Yeah, it definitely does.
Yeah. Because it's a real issue. And it means that we need to be ready to clarify the best we can. And that's why I always say, if you want to do good apologetics, you've also got to do some theology. You got to have a working knowledge of the Bible and some basic theology, because a big part of apologetics is clarifying what Christianity really does.
Oh, did I hear right? In order to do good apologetics, you have to do good theology. Isn't all apologetics theology? What about apologetics is not theology?
And does not teach.
And if it's in any part that you might mention that's not theology, isn't that just called, let's say, history then?
I found right from the beginning, I would have people share some things about what Jesus said or what Jesus did. And I said, are you sure Jesus said that? Are you sure Paul said that? What exactly did Paul say? What exactly did it say back in Genesis or whatever? And get.
Yeah, those are great questions. Are you sure Jesus said that? Paul Chamberlain, are you sure Jesus said anything in the Gospels that are claimed to have been said by him? Are you sure? Are you positive? Could you list very quickly off the top of your head 5 reasons why maybe Jesus didn't say the things he said in the New Testament? And if you can't, you haven't begun to know why you believe what you believe.
Get back there, and by clarifying it, we are often able to give an answer right there. And I think that's, but of course you can't do that without some knowledge of the Bible and some knowledge of theology. That's why you have to have both.
Paul, one of the things that comes out in the book that I think is particularly helpful, you spend a lot of time on it, and that's on the reliability of the New Testament.
Yeah, right.
Here we go.
And it sounds like that one of the major intellectual reasons why people leave their faith has to do with their belief in the reliability of the New Testament being undermined. Now, I know that's a big complex subject, but if you could summarize this, what's the case that you would make for why we should trust that the New Testament portrayal of Jesus and the resurrection is really accurate?
Well, for sure. Well, I mean, there's so much to say about that, Scott. But
you know, we're almost done this podcast, and only now is this being brought up. Like, this is you can't know anything about Jesus or Christianity without the New Testament. Nothing. Christianity exists because of the New Testament. Otherwise, we would just have Judaism. So it's like, why? Like, there's 6 minutes left in this podcast, and now this is coming up.
It's a great point. It's a great question. I had no idea I'd be putting that much effort into it in the book when I started writing it. But as I came across more and more things, I realized we just have to do it. But I tell you what really was key for me, was critical for me, even in my own personal thinking as I wrote, that I began to realize that a lot of people today wonder, do we have the correct books in the New Testament to begin with? The ones that are there, what do we do with when we see differences, discrepancies, or what people sometimes charge?
The question is about the reliability of the New Testament. He's going to correct books. Yes, that's an issue, but it's not the major issue.
There's outright contradictions. Are we supposed to believe this one or that one? And it goes on and on with questions like that. What about the textual variants we have, the differences in the manuscripts upon which the New Testament is based? And these are questions that really cut to the foundation, because it means that if we really don't have good answers on these, we're not even really sure what Jesus said or what did. How can we follow him if we don't really know who he was or what he said or what he did? And I found, as I began to read further, that I was so encouraged by the rigor that the early Christians used. I really have to take my hat off to these folks. That the rigor they used when they ruled on which books were to be considered.
He's really impressed with the rigor that the early Christians used.
Authoritative. They set out their criteria, really two major ones as far as I could tell. The books had to be early and had to have an apostolic connection. And there was some other pretty good material written there, but when they didn't meet that criteria, those two criteria, they were ruled out. They were sometimes considered helpful books, but they were not allowed for the public readings.
Does the rigor and the criteria of these early church fathers mean that the books themselves are true? Does the rigor and the carefulness of these early church fathers mean that maybe they actually made a mistake still? These are human beings, right? Do human beings make mistakes when it comes to the Bible or not?
Or the authoritative books and ultimately making it into the canon of Scripture. And you saw these criteria coming through in various ways. When people would write spurious books, like they say the Gospel of Peter, they would attach the names of one of these because the word was out that that's how you got your book to be taken as authoritative. You met those two criteria. And the church, of course, was there again very, very rigorous in deciding which ones were really went back to the earliest apostles. And I found that to be very, very helpful because it answers a lot of questions about whether we can trust the books we have there.
Do you have any, so these are reasons why you can trust the books that you have there, Paul Chamberlain, but can you think of any reasons why you may not trust it? This reminds me of that game that we used to play on Blab where I say like three numbers, 4, 7, 8. What's the rule? And people try to guess what the rule is for three numbers. And the goal is to try to find three numbers that falsify the rule. It's like it's a step of critical thinking that I think most Christians, most people in general do not possess, that when you're trying to see if something's true, you also have to at the same time find markers or reasons why it could be false or what would tell you that it's false. And then you can test it. So here Chamberlain is giving reasons why he's confident that the New Testament is true. Can he very quickly off the top of his head be willing to state to his Christian audience, here's reasons why we should not be confident in the New Testament? They will not do that because they would be terrified that their words might cause a young Christian to leave Christianity, and that's horrible. That's horrible. But I think smart guys like Paul Chamberlain can think of reasons to doubt, to question the reliability of the New Testament. But I really don't think they would tell you publicly. Maybe they would. I don't know. Actually, let's see if he does here.
And then when it came to things like the contradictions in the Bible, Well, I found there, I was deeply encouraged by that study as well, because I found when you read the four Gospels, you find the core events are in full agreement. The big main core events, they're all there. There's really no dispute about those.
The core events are in agreement of the four Gospels? Are the four Gospels in agreement that there was resurrection appearances? Awkward silence from Paul Chamberlain. Are the four Gospels in agreement that there was resurrection appearances, Paul Chamberlain? That's a core issue, is it not? Let me give you a hint, Paul Chamberlain. Mark doesn't have any resurrection appearances, except the later added manuscripts from like the 4th or 5th century was added later. But Paul, the Gospel of Mark ends in a cliffhanger with no resurrection appearances. That's a pretty big deal. Isn't that a reason for you to doubt a little bit the reliability of the New Testament, Paul Chamberlain? Would you be willing to state that publicly? Yes, Doug, you're right. Gospel of Mark has no resurrection appearances. And it just ends with women telling no one that the tomb was empty. It's almost like the Gospel of Mark was written in a way begging for a sequel. It's almost like the Gospel of Mark, the first Gospel written, was written in a way like a passion narrative, like a movie script.
Science and differences in details, which is exactly what you would expect by four independent witnesses that were...
Four independent witnesses. See, Paul Chamberlain, Sean McDowell, I sure hope you watch this, listen to this. I know this is a long video. But like, you have to stop saying silly things like you just said, that these are four independent accounts. When I think, Paul Chamberlain, you know this is not true, at least not entirely. Paul Chamberlain, I think you're smart enough to know about the synoptic problem, and that Matthew and Luke borrowed heavily from the Gospel of Mark and added things to it. And John is just way out there and written late. Even Christians say that John was written like towards the end of the 1st century, when almost definitely anybody alive who's, if this is true, would be dead at that point. These are the reasons why Christians are leaving Christianity, who, let's, as you guys put it, the intellectual type Christians. Don't say that these are four independent eyewitness accounts, because you know that's not true. You know that's not true. Why are you telling Christians this?
All had good access to the information.
Oh, Brother John says he said four witnesses instead of eyewitnesses. I'm scared to try to back up the tape on this. But even if he said witnesses, they're still not independent. Right, John? What is it, like 60% or so of Matthew borrows from Mark? And like, if you listen to historians, New Testament historians, even Christians will admit this, that odds are that Matthew, the author of Matthew, the author of Luke, had the book of Mark open in front of them when they wrote. And don't even name their sources. They don't even say that they took stuff from Mark, when it's obvious they did.
And you even find some very good plausible harmonizations. People like Craig Blomberg, who you both would know.
This is another reason why Christians are leaving Christianity, because when it comes to the topic of contradictions, and I very rarely use that word when I'm talking to Christians, I'll just call it frictions or tensions. You just heard him. He said plausible harmonizations. It's like, if there's a way to make it fit, then let's make it fit, shall we? Rather than maybe, if you're a truth seeker, if you value truth, you wouldn't say that. You would say, okay, we could make it fit, but maybe it's just wrong, or maybe there is a real tension here and that the two authors disagreed. Why is that out of the question? Why can't a Christian admit that? I'll tell you why. Because once they admit that, then their confidence on the whole thing goes right down the tubes. And they're basically left with what Ravi Zacharias said earlier in the stream, that I just have no other explanation for the feeling I had that Jesus saved my life. They can't go there. They can't admit that an author of the New Testament could be wrong about something. Oh, I watched a video recently of a woman trying to defend Paul's take on women's role in the church, that women should be silent and so forth. And she like made 3 videos. I think they're like 10, 20 minutes each, seeing how it can all fit, and that Paul really didn't mean that women should remain silent and blah, blah, blah. And I just made a very simple comment to her via text. I said, well, what if Paul was just wrong? Like, you don't have to spend hours trying to make it fit, when the simplest answer is, maybe Paul was just wrong and he contradicted himself, or he wasn't consistent, if you don't like the word contradicted. Why is that off the table? It's because they need this to be true. And if it's off the table, then if they consider for a moment that this isn't God's word, then it's like, and I'm talking about fundamentalists here, conservatives, which Sean McDowell and I'm sure this Paul Chamberlain is.
Have done some excellent work on this, and others as well. So as I looked at it, I thought, these texts, I have great confidence in these 4 texts, these 4 Gospels, to give us reliable information about Jesus. And from there, it's just a matter of what you will do then with that information. So, and there's, of course, much more that you could say, but these are all core, and I just bring this up again and again and again to people, and share people that, in my view, we are a very...
Paul Chamberlain, Sean McDowell, if you want my respect... and my guess is you don't care if you have my respect or not, but if you even want a dialogue with a guy like me, I'll put the first olive branch out there. I'm willing to tell you all the reasons why one could believe that this is reliable, that the New Testament's reliable, and why it's one should believe it. I can play that part, but I want to hear from you, Paul. I want to hear from you, Sean McDowell. Reasons why one should seriously doubt the New Testament is a reliable source of information. I want you to be able to role play as someone who is not convinced. Now, Sean McDowell, I've seen you do something like this before, but I'm talking about now we're getting to the deep, deep stuff, the intellectual stuff. I want you to go there, not with the big picture stuff. But I want you to delve into the weeds and tell me why, okay, here's why I think maybe why Matthew didn't write Matthew, or why Luke maybe didn't write Luke, or why Luke or any of the gospel writers might not be written by people who walked with Jesus. I want you to even tell me why maybe there wasn't even 12 disciples. Could you answer that question convincingly from let's say my point of view, why I would even doubt there was 12 disciples? Can you, off the top of your head?
Fortunate and blessed people to have these 4 independent Gospels written by people who were close to the scene, right at hand, had access. And it looked like they were willing to write the truth, the whole truth, even if it was embarrassing to them at times.
Yeah, see, he says that for a reason, even if it's embarrassing to them at times. Christians, historical type Christians, will say, "Oh, the criteria of embarrassment is just amazing. Why women at the tomb? That would be embarrassing." And it's like I've said in the past, the infancy Gospels are really embarrassing for Jesus as well. Did we say that the infancy Gospels gospel is true because it's very embarrassing, makes Jesus look kind of like a spoiled brat kid? No Christian would say the infancy gospel is true, but it's very embarrassing. That criteria is, I understand why people use that criteria, but it does have its weaknesses. But again, if you can't say off the top of your head quickly why women at the tomb, although it might be in some respects look embarrassing, why that reason for a guy like me is just total crapola. If you don't know why I would say that, you haven't even begun to understand the reasons why you believe.
It's all in there as well. So I'm not sure there's more we could say, but those are the things that were really core to me, Scott.
That's great. Thanks for including this in your book, Making a Case for the New Testament. Let me ask you 2 last questions, and you're going to have to give me your quick Twitter response to these.
Oh, okay.
What encouragement would you give to somebody who's listening who finds themselves having it feel like...
Silhouette, I talked about Ravi. in the very, very first part of this stream, and it kind of evolved into this long discussion.
Like they're moving towards stop believing, finding faith difficult. What quick encouragement would you give to that person?
I was...
Okay, I honestly have not heard his answer to this question. I honestly don't know how he's going to answer. But this is a great question. This is a question I've asked people, like, if you had to leave your loved ones and your loved one was doubting Jesus Christ, what one thing would you say? And my guess is he's going to say something like, I'm putting myself out on a limb here. I could be way wrong. He's going to say something like, don't give up. It's going to be an emotional appeal is my prediction, somewhere in that area. That don't give up. Keep up the good race. You will find answers to your questions. God, Jesus will never leave you or forsake you. Something like that. I could be totally wrong. Let's see how bad I am here at my prediction.
I would say make sure that you sit down and you make a little note, a little list to yourself. What are the reasons I might leave? What are they? 1, 2, 3, and then pursue those into the ground. If there's an intellectual objection, get the best, most thoughtful Christian responses. If it's another objection, get the best responses you can, and pursue those to the ground. Do not walk away without getting the best responses you can to whatever your reasons for leaving might be. That would be my very quick Twitter response to that.
I was kind of right. Basically, he said, "Don't give up. Keep plugging away." Okay, that was the end. What did you guys think of that? Stickman Sam, we talked about women of the tomb earlier. A guy like me would say, I could list a whole bunch of reasons why the women of the tomb, although it may seem embarrassing. First of all, I'll go from general to specific. General, we have good reason to think there was no women at all in the story. We have good reason to think that there was no tomb at all in the story. We have, in other words, I'm cutting the legs under the idea of the reliability of the New Testament from the start. But even if I grant that there were women and so forth, the reason why I doubt there was even women is because we don't even know. The numbers are all over the place. Where they went is all over the place. Mary Magdalene goes and she runs back to get disciples and goes back again. We got one man, two men, two angels. We got the stone was it rolled away before or after? There's so many reasons to doubt what actually happened, but throughout all the narrative in the book of Mark, the first gospel written, we have this theme of that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. We got reversals of expectations. And so even if an author was to put this embarrassing fact in, like we got the men being like idiots and the women being like the real ones who know Jesus, it fits in with the story. The story has that theme. And plus, as I said earlier to you, Shane, or Stickman Sam, that the author put this in a story of, remember I think Mark says that they bought spices. It's because in the story, Jesus was taken down the cross fast and because the Sabbath was coming, and so they were going to do the burial rites. That's why they bought the spices in the morning. Now, some Gospels don't even talk about the spices, but I think 2 of the 4 do. And so it makes total sense in the story that women would be the first ones at the tomb and therefore the first ones to see Jesus, because no man at that time would touch a dead body. That was a woman and slave job. If you don't believe me, ask Tim Keller himself. And so, I could go on and on with reasons why this whole, and I already explained why the criterion of embarrassment is maybe not the best criterion to begin with. So if you're a Christian and you can't do this, you can't just riff on reasons to doubt, to question this off the top of your head. Like I said, you haven't even begun to understand the reasons why you believe, if it has to do with the New Testament. Well, Stickman Sam, I basically told you, I gave you a huge hint that was one of the cases. Oh, and Stickman Sam, remember another thing. as embarrassing as Christians like women being the first ones to appear to, Jesus being the first one to appear to the women, what did almost every gospel say? Go tell the men, because then it's really solidified. And even in the book of John, what does the book of John say? It says that Mary went to the tomb, saw that the stone was removed. It's not clear if she peered in or not. And she immediately ran back to get men. Does that sound like an embarrassing thing for the time? From your point of view? It's like the disciple that Jesus loved and the disciple and John, or Lazarus, whoever those two are. Hey, thanks for the donation, Shane. Boy, I'm starting to get full of Applebee's. No, I appreciate it a lot, guys. Just the fact that Mary went back to get men, like, why do you leave that out when you're describing the embarrassment of women? It's like it still was male-centric back then within the story, even if women were the first ones. And keep in mind, Stickman Sam, that Mary didn't even recognize Jesus when Jesus appeared to her in the book of John. She thought he was a gardener. It's like, what good is an appearance if, like, you have to do a double take? Who are you? Brother John, the Gospel of Mark, the first gospel ever written, says that the women told nobody what they saw, that the tomb was empty. Didn't one gospel have Jesus breakdancing at the tomb? Now you're just mocking 71 definitions. Now you're just attacking. There was one guy named Mark Seidel who was trying to say that Yahweh is not Jesus' father. He is dishonestly trying to distance his precious Jesus from the horrors of the Old Testament. Well, you don't even have to do that. All you have to do is be a Unitarian, a non-Trinitarian, to distance yourself from Yahweh. Or you can be like what I call a nuanced Christian, that just view the teachings of Jesus as a way to help love others and be kind to others. And to be honest, like, I don't want to, I'd rather have Christians like that who will just admit from the get-go, I believe because it makes me feel good and it helps me with my relationships. Yeah, maybe it gives me some hope of afterlife or something like that. Like, if that's where you're coming from, so be it. I kind of respect that. If someone says to me, look, my life sucks, I need this, just, if you're that type of person, don't watch my channel. But if you're the type of person who says, I'm voting this way because this is what Jesus would want me to do, then please keep watching my channel. Jesus asks, what are your thoughts on the Transfiguration? I think it's mimicking Elijah, the story of the Old Testament. Even a lot of Christians don't think that actually happened. The Transfiguration in the Gospels is a really bizarre thing. It almost comes out like it actually happened in history, and then it kind of backtracks on itself. I would have to read it again to refresh my memory. What do you do when Christians tell you you don't know how to read the Bible? I keep running into this. Don't know how to read the Bible? You mean like hermeneutics? Most times I just let them believe what they want to believe about me. I'm not the type of person who gets offended or defensive if someone thinks I'm just an idiot. I actually kind of I'm totally okay with that. Low expectations is the biggest mistake people make. I mean, as far as when people have low expectations on me, I like it. Cue the stripper music, Doug. Okay. I don't have the, well, is that stripper music? That's not stripper music. Where did my, oh, there it is. I'll take a couple more questions here. Jesus asks, I'm in. Let me turn it down. It's so loud, I can't even hear myself. Can you guys hear me? Where are you getting your Christian stuff from? Seems you listen to a lot of liberal Christian or something. Sheesh. Liberal Christians? Well, I do listen to liberal Christians, but most of my content is geared towards the conservative Christians. No, I have not listened to that podcast, Silhouette. I don't think. Maybe I haven't. I just don't remember. Yeah, Brother John. That's why the precepts have, in a way, a better argument, because they just say, well, guys like Doug, they don't have the Holy Spirit, so give them a break. How can they understand these things? Okay, guys. Have a great, great day. Take care.